Well, excited to be here. It's been great meeting a lot of you so far, and excited to get started with my first talk, which is a super important one, and looking forward to all the other talks too. But to start, it's about building sustainable player-owned economies. So I want to give everyone a glimpse of our latest thinking around player-owned economies at Sky Mavis. As we co-create Axie Infinity together, it's important for our community and for all of us together to understand these concepts and build it together. And as more Web3 games come out, it's going to become more and more important for us to figure these things out in a way that is sustainable and makes sense and can last for the future. A lot of this is obviously new and is all being learned over the past few years and in the upcoming years. So to start, I wanted to start at the beginning with Web 2 games. We had some amazing games in the Web 2 world. We had the Fortnites, the Minecrafts, the Hearthstones of the world. And the model was quite simple. So you have a game, and it gives you some sort of intrinsic value in fun. So from social to competitive achievements to exploration, creativity, you would get this value as gamers. And from there, people would spend their time and their effort and their money to get this value. And it made sense. It was a simple model, and that could have been in the form of just playing the game a lot, could have been buying console games, could have been spending in-app purchases. But what these games did not have as much of was ownership. And so with these games, you had limited ownership over the assets you got. You couldn't sell most of them. You couldn't buy from other people. You couldn't trade them. If you tried to sell them in gray markets, you might get banned. If you did something wrong, you can have your assets wiped, and it was all on one server, so the developers could basically do what they wanted. And this is all changing. So with the blockchain, we now have player-owned assets. And so with decentralized blockchains, we unlock immutable ownership of your digital assets. And basically, there's no single owner that controls your digital assets and what you do with them and your ownership. And it's all kind of there on the blockchain. Is everything perfectly decentralized? No, we are working our way there. Is it a massive paradigm shift in games as a whole? Definitely and completely. And at the same time, when we look at Web 2 games and the evolution of Web 3, Web 3 games still got to keep all those elements that I talked about, the intrinsic value, the fun, the competitiveness, the social value, the exploration. All those things need to be there. And this ownership element is this added bonus on top and this additional value that people get. And so that's kind of how they should be looked at. So with digital assets now on the blockchain, they gain a lot of the properties of physical assets like amiibos or Pokemon cards or Warhammer figures. And they basically can be used and owned and also have utility of their own. And so amiibos can unlock a lot of bonuses in different games. Pokemon cards you can use for battle. And another property that they inherit similar to physical assets is that their utility can change over time. And so they can gain more utility or less utility. For example, with Pokemon cards, there's different set rotations in tournaments. So you might have a powerful card, but once they deprecate that set, now it might not have as much utility. And then you get new cards. You might have an amiibo that gets extra bonuses in a game when a new game comes out. And so their utility can change over time. And so digital assets have these properties as well. And so with that and the ability to sell them, to trade them, to gift them, you basically have, by default, an economy created. And with that economy comes real money value on a lot of these assets. And that really changes a lot of things in games, as you might have noticed. So now players care a lot more about inflation, about scarcity of their assets, how that changes, which was not necessarily the case in Web 2 games. And it's a completely new dynamic that needs to be managed with Web 3 games. So for example, with Pokemon Go, there was a resource called Stardust. And Stardust is used to power up your Pokemon. And it just You get it from a lot of different sources in the game, but you just accumulate it over time. I have millions of it at this point. And even as it inflates across the board, it doesn't really matter, because you can't trade it. There's no real world value. You just get more, and when you need to use it, you use it, and no one complains about that. In Web3, if this was an asset with real money value, it wouldn't be the same. And so that's why this is a new kind of challenge for Web3 that we have to really understand and look at and manage. And we've seen how this can be a difficult thing to manage. When things are unbalanced, you can get a lot of inflation, you can run into issues, and it gets particularly highlighted if the player base is very focused on that monetary value of that asset. So this brings us to how do we build the sustainable economies. And so some keys that I'll highlight today include intrinsic value, which is fundamental to any product, any game needs to provide some sort of intrinsic value. Really managing that narrative around your product, making sure that people understand what it's about, those expectations, and then finally economy design. So let's start with intrinsic value. This is pretty straightforward, actually. For any product that you try to get, you put effort to obtaining, or you spend money on, you do it because you get some sort of intrinsic value, which is basically value that you get for the sake of it, and things you want to get just because we as human beings, we have a lot of needs and wants, and these things satisfy those. And this is in contrast to extrinsic value, which is you get paid to do something, or you do something for money. And it's with most products, the way they work is the users or players or whatever it is spends money and puts it into the system. But if everyone expects to take more out than they put in, it's ultimately not sustainable, because where does it come from, right? And we've seen countless examples, not just in Web3, but Web2 as well, where people are motivated by some sort of extrinsic value to use a product, and products will provide discounts or promotions or incentives to use their product. But if the intrinsic value is not there, then eventually all those people leave once the extrinsic values run out. And so it's very important to have this as a base. For example, with Pokemon cards, they have intrinsic value in that people love the game, people love the cards, people love the Pokemon themselves, and so they just want to get them for the sake of it, and that's why there's such strong value in those. Even though it actually is a very inflationary system. They're printing and creating new Pokemon cards all the time. They've re-released base set Charizard 5 times now. I've bought all of them probably, and so the reason is because people love them. I just want all the Charizards for the sake of it. And so that's kind of the key underlying part of games that they need to have. And what are some of these things that games need to think about in terms of intrinsic values? There's a lot of different models out there, from Quantic Foundry or kind of the more classic Bartle taxonomy of gamers, of motivations that people have for playing games. And all of you have different ones, and all of games cater to different ones as well. So you have things from action to you want to be a PvPer, you want to just beat people, you want to just socialize, you want to hang out and explore. There's a lot of different motivations, and as Web3 games go through this process of designing their games, they need to figure out what are the things that I'm providing, what is the intrinsic value I'm giving to the players. And with that, they can then design all the mechanics to make sure it aligns to it, make the animations exciting, make the progression engaging, make the social systems frictionless, and just create that value. And so ultimately, it comes back to you've got to make a great game first. And so, for example, with Axie Infinity, with SLP, it really only has value at the end of the day because people want it to make more Axies that they want to collect, or they want to craft runes and charms that they want to use to rank up on the leaderboard and really achieve and hit those achievements. And so the next one is narrative. And some people, once they got the game ready, they want to jump into the tokenomics and the economy. But this is actually a key area to focus on before that, especially given how games in Web3 have player-owned economies that have real-world value, that makes it even more important to manage this. For Web2 games, they really focus on the fun. They focus on the adventure, what you're going to do in the game, what fantasy you can live out in the game. Web3 games also focus on this, but they also want to find that balance of educating people on the ownership side. And as much as there is that full game, you want to have that bonus value that you express and educate players on top of it. And so figuring out that narrative is extremely important. And with Web 2 games, ultimately 100% of the revenues that go into them go back to the developer. With Web 3 games, some of that gets shared back with the players. And although on aggregate, it'll never be as much that's put in, it's infinitely more than what people would get in the Web 2 space. And so ultimately, that narrative needs to be managed and making sure they understand there's the game and the intrinsic value, and then this bonus value on top of ownership, and educating the community on that. And it's a bit counterintuitive, but talking more about the game and making sure that you have the right narrative actually helps the economy as a whole, as that's what drives the economy, is that intrinsic value. And so focusing on that and maybe talking less about the economy and more on the game sometimes and balancing out with the ownership could be more valuable to the economy in the long term. The way to do this is through all the methods that people have, from websites, PR, ads, all the typical kind of marketing channels, and making sure those are all aligned to the right narrative, and making sure the community, the influencers, the content creators are also all aligned to driving that correct message and narrative. One thing that's a bit less obvious is this idea of pre-sales and the price to play a game. And these are actually extremely important factors that help shape people's mindsets and narratives about a game. If there's a very high price to start playing a game, if someone spends a lot of money just to get started, then they naturally will start thinking about, okay, am I going to get this back? Whereas with classic games and with Web 2 games, people just play, and they play the game, and they spend when they want to. And those are things that really need to be thought about when games are developed, so that you set the right mindset with people to start and really focus on the game. Finally, we get to the economy design. There's tons of different designs out there, structures. I'll talk a bit about a couple areas that we think are important, but there's probably models out there that we haven't even seen yet. So one thing to keep in mind for economy design is if there is any part of the economy that can be abused or exploited, it probably will. So you got to make sure it's airtight. You got to be very thoughtful and very careful, especially with blockchain, where you can't go back on a lot of things. And so here's a couple key ideas to consider. The first is just that your sinks, which are where people spend the resources, need to be greater than their source, especially for the real world, real money value tokens. And so basically, if you have your source exceeding that, then you have inflation over time, and then we get the bot farms, we get the multi-accounters, and you get this massive inflation that is hard to reverse. And so it's important to make sure that this is part of that economic design as you go through creating a Web3 game. At the individual level, yeah, some people might be able to generate more tokens or more resources, some people less, but on an aggregate, this needs to be true for a balanced economy ultimately. How that detailed structure and economy really depends on the type of the game. There's tons of different genres of games out there that should be structured differently, and so there's many different ways to make sure that you have this in place. The next one is a hybrid off-chain and on-chain economy, and this actually is key to satisfying the first principle that I talked about. And when you think about it, it's really hard for players to get started if they're limited in the amount of resources they're getting, that source. And so if we give a lot of real money assets at the beginning of the game, though, then you also get the bots and the farming. And so it's this nuanced process where if you just have people join and they can start earning tokens and they can start generating a lot of different resources, then you might get issues with inflation. But if you don't, now the game is not as fun because people can't progress as quickly. And that's why this off-chain, on-chain economy kind of idea is one that we found to be quite effective, where people can come in, they can play that off-chain game to start, really enjoy, love the game, collect some assets, learn how everything works, and just play the game for fun. And then eventually, when they're ready, they can onboard to the on-chain side of things and get educated on the values of being able to trade those assets, to own those assets. And over time, people can take that slow progression. And this not only helps manage the economy to make sure that you can make sure it's all sustainable, but it also makes the game much easier to onboard for all people who might not be as familiar with the blockchain yet. And so this is an important concept that we've been embracing for a lot of our games, as you've seen with Origin as well. And so how are we applying these? We think about all these and how they apply to our unique situation, kind of our history, what we have out, our future plans, our discussions with the community. And we touch on all of them. So the intrinsic value, obviously, that's just making a really solid game. As you've seen with Origin, we've been spending a lot of time just talking to you, figuring out with the community, what is the best gameplay, how do we make it more balanced. It's still obviously a process that's ongoing, and we want to continue to push that, and we spend a lot of effort. And then it's also supporting a lot more fun experiences, like builders games and building out our land game, and making sure all of that just provides really fun, engaging gameplay that provides that intrinsic value to all of you. And on the narrative side, obviously educating on this whole system, which is new for a lot of people, how it all works, how sustainability is built out, giving presentations like this. And on the free-to-play part, reducing that barrier to entry so people can just come in, use starter Axies, start playing, and just play the game for what it is and onboard to the blockchain side over time. And the last part is the economy design. So as you've noticed in Origin, we do have this kind of off-chain, on-chain hybrid economy where we have moon shards, which are off-chain, that give that initial progression, and then we have on-chain SLP that people get, that they can craft more runes and charms, breed more Axies in the future too. We want to add in more different types of economic systems in the future that will just be exciting and fun to play as well, basically, with upgrades and cosmetics, more different types of runes and charms. And yeah, that's all. We think about all those aspects all of the time. And so with that, we want to shift the narrative further. So we started with play to earn, and then we went to play and earn. And to grow sustainably in the future, we are finally going to land on play and own, and to really focus on the ownership aspects of the blockchain and make sure people understand and get educated on how to look at this space, how to look at blockchain games, and further grow sustainably over all of our games that we release in the future too. We're moving towards a future that is owned by, where games are owned by the players. You have the power to influence everything I've talked about, and that'll be the reason why Axie succeeds, ultimately. Help everyone in our community realizes just how much power and responsibility you have to educate new players, to talk about the right ways to look at different games, how to approach games, and that is what's going to make Axie sustainable, is all of you, and sharing this message and educating others and understanding how really to build sustainable player-owned economies. And that's all I had for today. Thank you.